Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. A big welcome to you all to Microsoft Copilot Week. My name is Sean, and I'm delighted you are joining us for today's ESBC community webinar. Today I'm joined by Alan Cox, who will cover Securing the Digital Assistant, Navigating Security Considerations for Copilot in Microsoft 365. We love hearing what you guys have to say, so remember to join in on the conversation about today's webinar and more on X. Our handle is at ESBC_community, and our hashtag is hashtag ESBC24. Tweet us, tag us, and tell us what you learned. Don't forget to check out our Learning Hub, which is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. You can access and view the Learning Hub by visiting our website, sharepointeurope.com, and clicking the Content tab at the top. Don't let the learning stop here. Continue to keep up and stay ahead by joining us for our next webinar. The top reasons 75% of low-code, no-code programs fail and how to make yours succeed with Jonas Waters. This webinar takes place Tuesday, 28th of May, 2024 at 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. CEST. For more information on this webinar, please check out www.sharepointeurope.com/register for webinars. Exciting news! The ESPC 24 program is out now. Get ready for 100 plus sessions covering all your favorite Microsoft 365 topics, from governance to Azure, AI to security, and much more. Our fantastic program team has curated top-notch content to boost your knowledge. Join us in Stockholm for this stellar event. Book your tickets today at www.sharepointeurope.com/pricing. Get ready to dive in a day filled with insights, inspiration, and innovation. Don't miss out on a chance to connect with industry experts and acquire the skills necessary for success. Save the date because EPBC is right around the corner, taking place next month. With just a few 2-day tickets remaining, seize this opportunity to secure your spot today by visiting our website www.sharepointeurope.com/European Power Platform Conference pricing. Exciting news! Introducing the European Microsoft Fabric Community Conference. Mark your calendars for September 24th to 27th for an experience packed with workshops, keynotes, and breakout sessions led by Microsoft experts. Explore the latest trends in Microsoft Fabric, including Azure AI and Microsoft Purview. Don't miss out. Register your interest today at www.sharepointeurope.com/European Microsoft Fabric Community Conference. After this webinar, we'll have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you might have into the questions box. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you'll be notified by email when it is available. And now, I'm going to pass you over to today's webinar presenter, Alan. Hello, Alan. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Good deal. Making sure we're all set. You can see my screen okay?
Yep, I can see you and I can see your screen perfectly, Alan.
Very good. Well, I appreciate y'all joining today. And so we're going to just have a little conversation about securing the digital assistant and exactly what all that means, how we can prepare for Copilot going forward, making sure that you deploy this in a secure and efficient way, and that all of your data is protected under Copilot. So we're going to have a lot to cover. We're absolutely going to do everything I can to get Q&As in. I'll be sharing my contact information, both direct email address, phone phone number, as well as LinkedIn profile. So be sure to hit me up there. If we don't get to a lot of the questions today, we welcome those, and we'll get right to those through those other means as well. So let me ask a few questions. What do we have in place today that would prevent someone from accidentally sharing sensitive information? And do you have, or do you know rather, what items you have in your environment today that might contain PII, private identifiable information, or PHI, maybe public health information? And do you know who has access to those items within your environment? And is governance sort of and compliance an afterthought in your organization, or do you have a very structured way of dealing with governance within your organization? So those are some of the things that I want you to think about as we talk about compliance and governance and preparing your organization for a secure rollout of Microsoft Copilot or Copilot for 365, and we'll talk a lot about Microsoft Copilot for Microsoft 365. So that's the big one. That's what everybody's really talking about. We will briefly touch on Copilot, Microsoft Copilot, or Bing Chat, Copilot Chat. So we'll talk through that. Um, and so about me, I am Alan Cox. I manage a group out of Microsoft 365 platform advisors. Um, in our platform advisory service at Thrive, which we'll talk a little bit more about Thrive here in just a second. But here's my contact information. As I mentioned, QR code directly to my LinkedIn profile. Feel free to hit me up with any questions, connect, and let's continue down this path together and learn together. And so I've been in the IT field for almost 30 years now, but probably 25 of those years have been solely around consulting and helping organizations, advance their technology. Of course, much of that was, a lot on-prem stuff, heavy background in Exchange and Intune and all of that. And so my team's focus is mostly around the collaboration areas, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So just a little bit about Thrive. Um, we can get my slides to forward there. There we go. We are a next-gen managed services provider. We host private cloud, hybrid, of course, promote a lot of public cloud as well. Founded in 2000, roughly 1,400, probably more than that now, 1,400 employees, SOC 2 Type 2, certified, compliant, and so big, heavy presence in the cybersecurity area. It's a big focus for us, and so our drive and our passion is to help advance your presence in the Microsoft 365 across all platform areas, whether it's SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive, and of course Exchange, Intune, and all of that. But to do it in a very secure way. And so we have a lot of services just bundled just around cybersecurity. So it's a big part of what we do. We are based, the headquarters is in Foxborough, Massachusetts, here in the U.S. I'm actually in Missouri in the U.S., so that's where I'm physically at. However, our presence is throughout the United States pretty heavily, but also throughout the world within Canada and Europe, Asia Pacific. So a lot of locations growing really, really quickly. It's been pretty amazing in even just the last several years. So the team that I manage specifically we'll call out in this area. This is our platform services team, but specific areas that my team focuses on would be the Azure Active Directory, of course, now Azure ID. We focus a lot of that. Security, governance, compliance, strategic consulting, helping organizations, move to the next level. We do some Power Platform consultation, SharePoint, Internet designs, migrations, all of these from an advisory standpoint. We do have engineers and delivery folks that help execute a lot of that for us, but we're solely and squarely on the advisory front. So that's just a little bit about us. So let's just kind of move on and we'll get right to it. So what we're going to talk about today. We're gonna go through just a brief introduction. We're gonna kind of understand Copilot, what Copilot is, I'm sure, unless you've been under a rock for a little while, you probably have a pretty good idea of what it is. But we'll look up at a little bit at the architecture around Copilot for Microsoft 365. Then we'll get right into some of the security foundations and principles there, as well as zero trust. We'll talk about compliance and tenant configuration. What are some of the things you need to do from a tenant standpoint and compliance standpoint, some of the requirements, et cetera. Then we'll get into some best practices in data security for data security and governance. We'll talk a little bit about Microsoft privacy and permissions and things you need to know there. Then finally, we're going to get right into preparing your organization. What are really kind of button it all up? What are some things you need to know to move forward with Microsoft Copilot and beginning in that foundational stage of even Copilot, Microsoft Copilot. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Um, so as we get into just the introduction part of it, so Microsoft coordinates the large language model, we refer to them as LLMs, that large language model, uh, content from the graph, from the Microsoft graph, and the Microsoft apps that you use in every day, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Office, Office apps and Teams and so forth. They're the large language model is an AI algorithm that use deep learning and data sets that help you basically generate natural language. So that's the nice thing about we're talking about Copilot or Copilot for 365. If you're not licensed for the Copilot for 365, you go out to copilot.microsoft.com. Your tenant should have access to the Bing chat, and you probably have seen that. It's now Copilot chat, but you can use very specific natural language to interact with that large language model. So that's the nice thing about it. You don't have to talk like a robot, for example. We'll get a little bit more into that. So I'll tell you, industries are really moving at a fast pace. It seemed like Microsoft 365 kind of stalled a little bit. Yeah, they move your cheese a little bit, move things around, but it really seemed like things were just kind of stalled out just a little bit, not a whole lot of earth-shattering stuff. And then they came out with Loop, which fantastic, and I use it a lot. But then Copilot. And Copilot really changed the game when Microsoft said, well, now you don't have to have 300 licenses. You don't have to go through an enterprise agreement. You don't have to have E3, E5. All of those requirements were moved, and really it kind of, turned consulting for a lot of consulting firms like even ours kind of upside down a bit because now folks were asking about it extensively. Um, so that's just kind of where we're at with the technologies just keep moving really fast. The growth curve, and I know you probably have seen this. This is just an excellent illustration of just how fast things are moving in this area. The race to 100 million users. Mobile phones was 16 years, internet 7 years, Facebook 4.5 years, and then now we're not recording this as just this gradual lift. It's literally a vertical line to that race for 300. And so ChatGPT, 3 months. I mean, we're there in no time. So really, really quickly. So as we move to understand Copilot for Microsoft 365, we'll talk about how it integrates with all of the Microsoft apps. Quickly. So it is embedded, as you see here, right with seeing this is an example in Word. It's embedded right in the Office apps. It's integrated into Microsoft 365, the apps that we're using every day. So Word and Excel. Some of the Excel stuff is still in preview, but it's definitely a game changer in all of those apps as well. PowerPoint, Outlook, Teams, and more to come. When we're talking about Copilot, there's so many different Copilots, right? You've got Copilot Security. I think there was a session on Copilot Security. You've got Copilot for Dynamics. You've got Copilot for but as Copilot for Sales. A lot of different versions of Copilot. So just to be clear, we're talking about Copilot for Microsoft 365. So, but it works alongside of you, providing real-time assistance as you collaborate with folks or create documents, etc. Built around the large language model, as I mentioned. So that's what it's leveraging. So when you're writing, it's just suggesting some relevant content and can summarize discussions. And all of that is tapping into that Microsoft Graph. That is key. We're going to talk a lot about that, but Microsoft Graph is really key because that's where that integration allows Copilot to provide context-aware recommendations and insights based on um, you know your specific work context and documents and things that you're focused on right there. So a little bit of the architecture. We'll go through some of this architecture here. So user sends a prompt out to Copilot. That prompt is an input. So you know, create an agenda based off of X file, right? This file. Create an agenda based off of this file. So if you would set up a meeting, Copilot, then that's a prompt. Those prompts are what you're telling Copilot to actually do. I've gone into eCopilot, even just Microsoft Copilot, and given it a really long detail thing I wanted to do in PowerShell, and it kicks the script right back to me with very little tweaking. Always some, and you have to fill in some relevant information, but those are prompts. That's what we're talking about, prompts. Copilot then accesses the graph, plus potentially optional web grounding content. If it can't find everything it needs within your organization, then it will, that's configurable, we'll talk about it, but it'll go out to the web and find other relevant information. It's called web grounding. And so, in additional other services, if you've got connectors that tap to the graph, but the key is the graph. If you can't reach it there, Copilot's not going to be able to be of much use for your data, accessing your data. Copilot then sends a modified prompt over to the large language model. So it starts accessing the large language model that we talked just about. Um, the LLM then sends back a response. Copilot accesses the graph for that compliance and that purview, and that's the area we're really going to kind of focus on a little bit today. That area that's where it puts all the compliance wrappers around the data, whether it's labeling or retention policies, any kind of policy that we might have in purview. And we're going to talk, like I said, a lot about that. And then finally, Copilot sends back that response back to the user. But all of this is centered into the graph. The graph provides access to data stored across Microsoft 365 services. Custom applications can use the API, that connect to the data. So there are custom connectors that allow that graph to extend beyond just what's in Microsoft 365. But that graph contains all your data. So that's everything you've got in, from contacts to Teams chats to emails to groups to SharePoint data, calendaring information, all of that is all in the Microsoft Graph. So we've been talking about some security foundations and keeping data secure um, is an essential privacy principle at Microsoft. They critical to ensuring that um, we have trust in the AI systems. I'll be honest, when I was first diving into a little bit of the Copilot stuff, I was really skeptical, and honestly, not going to say that it doesn't weigh a heavy consideration, and that's a lot of what we're talking about. So I 100% for it and all for it. I think it's super powerful, but we do need to protect that, and so we have to by but Microsoft's primary goal is to make sure that we have confidence in their AI systems, Copilot, Microsoft Copilot, all the other Copilots, and they've really dedicated a lot of resources to ensuring that it is safe and secure. But we have things we have to do in order to further that security. Um, but Microsoft doubled downs on that with the Microsoft Trust Center. If you've ever been in the uh, trust portal out here. There's just it provides a lot of content and tools and other resources about how Microsoft Cloud Services protect your data and how you can manage cloud data security. for compliance. So Microsoft has third-party auditors that come in and do pen testing and all of that stuff. They don't police themselves. They kind of do it all on their, through other third parties. But there's tons of information out here. There's QR code there to take you right out there. There's a lot of their audit information and all of that. All of that is there. And so tons of documents. This is just a screenshot of just a sampling of the areas. And further that, here's specifically a screenshot with a QR code directly to this. It offers information about specifically their GDPR documentation and EU data boundary. So that EU data boundary is a geographically defined boundary within which Microsoft has committed to store and process customer data and personal data for enterprise online services like Exchange and Azure and Dynamics and Power Platform and all of that. All of it is, subject to limited circumstances where Microsoft data might be, moved outside that boundary. But Microsoft uses the EU data boundary specifically under some of those acts, and we'll talk just briefly about that. But they have this policies to ensure that things that are bound by that EU data boundary stay within that boundary, even though other things they can go into different data centers if necessary outside of that boundary. So when we talk about data access and user permission, here's some important things to understand. Your prompts, those inputs that we talked about, and Copilot's responses, so the response back from the large language model, those outputs and the results from the prompt are not available to other customers. They're not used to train or improve any third-party products like OpenAI models, ChatGPT, for example, and they're not used to further train Microsoft's AI model. Now, your tenant admin can opt in to share some of that data with Microsoft, but as a general rule, they're not used for any additional training or improving of the service itself. A keynote here is if your user has access, Copilot has access. And if we can summarize the whole presentation today, that's an important thing to understand is that if the user has access, Copilot has access. Copilot itself doesn't introduce uh, uh, security risk on its own. It just surfaces existing risks you may have. So Copilot is safe and secure. Microsoft's ensured that. It's what we're doing with the data Copilot can access, and that's really the focus of what we're talking about today. So we we have to talk about some zero trust principles. So before you introduce Copilot for Microsoft 365 or Copilot into your environment, Microsoft highly recommends that you build a strong foundation of security. And um, fortunately, good guidance around strong security is found in the form of zero trust. So zero trust security strategy, and that's exactly what it is. It's not a service, it's not a product or anything. It's a strategy, it's an approach. It's how we view security. But it treats each connection and resource request as though it's coming from an untrusted source. In a nutshell, zero trust says never trust, always verify. And so that's the principle we have to take with each approach. Um, the way it's used through Copilot is in this particular diagram. So at the top we have user devices have Microsoft apps installed, and from which users can initiate those Copilot prompts, as we showed in the screenshot earlier on Microsoft Word. Now, directly from there we can initiate these prompts. Copilot from there, then Copilot has two main components that it uses. One is a Copilot service, which orchestrates the responses to those prompts, but also has an instance of the Microsoft Graph that it taps into. And of course, that graph is directly connected to the last thing, and that is all your organizational data. So all of that um, that graph data is tapping into that graph is connecting directly, of course, into Microsoft 365. But Copilot is tapping directly to that graph. So some of the things we need to consider as we apply zero trust principles when we're thinking about Copilot. And so to prevent your organization from uh, from being at risk of overexposure and oversharing, the first step we want to do is protect that data in your Microsoft tenant. And several ways that we can do that. One is your data should be categorized with sensitivity levels. By levels, we're talking about, you've heard of classification, and I'm not going to assume, folks on the that's attending this webinar know all of this. So I know I'll explain some things that some of you know, some of you may not. But when we're talking about levels here, levels are, some things may not be. It may be public, so it could be okay. We can share that externally because there's no sensitive information. There's no information that may harm our business in some way or reputation. Then we should apply sensitivity labels that represent your classification or sensitivity levels that are applied either by the user or automatically. Of course, automatic labeling requires an E5 and compliance E5 or so forth. So, but at the very least, we should classify sensitive items. That's why I asked that question right out of the gate. If we knew what items that we have and within our environment that were sensitive. So Microsoft Purview can surface a lot of that information for us, but the classification levels are things like, this is sensitive, this is highly sensitive, this is highly, secure, and then applying labels that match those levels. We can also view in Purview how sensitivity labels are being applied across the organization. Um, so some of the items within, we talked about Purview, mentioned it. We'll dig in a little bit here in a minute, but um, you know a lot of things inside Purview that relate to Copilot are things like content searching, auditing. Talk about that, communication compliance, data classification, or those levels that we just mentioned. So we should ensure that our users are using strong passwords, strong authentication that can't be just compromised by guessing user account. Authentication attempts can be evaluated by their risk and have more requirements imposed. We'll talk briefly about that. That's an adaptive, for example, an adaptive DLP that says this user risk is this. They've had some sketchy sign-ins, so their risk levels up a little bit. And based on those risk levels, they can be assigned a specific or a different DLP policy. Maybe they're at risk, so you know what, we're not going to allow sharing at all. Maybe they have had no sign-in risk, so we can allow them to share. So that's that adaptive DLP. If you've ever seen that in Purview, that's exactly what it's talking about. We'll see a shot of that here shortly. So we can perform reviews on, we should perform reviews on access, periodic reviews on the different types of access granted to user accounts to prevent that oversharing. And we should also, by the way, while I'm mentioning it, do access reviews. Access reviews are an important thing that we should be um, you know, doing specifically around guest access reviews. I see a lot of clients that have, they may have 200 guests inside their Entra ID environment, Azure AD environment, but they don't. Many of those guests haven't signed in ever or a long time. So we can do access reviews that will periodically check for us automatically, and start nagging. Hey, you still need access. You still need access for that. So something we should definitely consider. Um, we cannot discuss compliance or governance and not talk about mobility. Um, for E3 and E5, we recommend that we use at the very minimum Intune app protection policies. So Intune app protection policies used to be called MAM. I still kind of old school, so we refer to them as MAM, or Mobile Application Management. Uh, or even further, MAM, where we have mobile application management without enrollment. So we're not talking about enrollment here. And most of the time, right here, we see this done in BYOD devices. So devices that the corporation doesn't own, your organization doesn't own, maybe a personal device with users who say, I want, Outlook mobile on my phone or Teams or OneDrive or whatever. Within Intune, we can apply a mobile policy that protects the data. And what it does is it puts a kind of this logical barrier between work and personal data. It does this both on Android and iOS. They do it a little bit differently, but they both do it nonetheless. And so you can then prevent copying and pasting from a app to a non-protected app. So prevents from copying an email from Outlook mobile and posting it right into LinkedIn, for example. That's a non-managed app. So um, we just can't forget that mobile is a pretty high area of leakage, especially they get lost and stolen. And so anyway, just some good considerations there. Deploy an app protection policy at the very least. Um, Taking that a step further, if we want to prevent bad actors from compromising devices or using compromised devices to gain access to Copilot stuff, then we should consider device management. And this is taking what we just talked about on mobile policies, just the app, taking it to a next level, and that's where we actually enroll the device, where we can apply compliance policies in order to require, for example, or in order to connect. So, for example, we can say if the device is jailbroken or rooted as an Android, so we're not going to allow you to connect because there's some inherent security flaws and vulnerabilities in there. So, because most of that stuff is going outside of the, protection of of whether it's Google or Apple. So um, we can administer the settings. We can literally turn off cameras, block screen sharing or screen capture, and all of those things there. And we can proactively prevent data loss. Most of the time we see this on corporate owned devices. A lot of users are a little bit hesitant to allow an organization to enroll their device, to manage their device. But they are prompted that says, hey, we can't look at your screenshot. We can't look at your browsing history. We can't look at all of, your text messages and all of, those things. It doesn't get into the personal stuff. But still, we generally see that more mobile app or the application protection policies just guarding the app and our corporate data. We usually see that with BYOD devices, and then full-on enrollment. We usually see that with more corporate-owned devices. But every organization is different in the way they handle that or what their acceptable use policies are. Um, Microsoft 365 can detect bad actors and keeping them from gaining access to Copilot through a variety of um, through a lot of different processes, and we've talked a little bit about Defender, but um, we, um, we should automatically, with Microsoft Defender, you can automatically prevent certain types of connections through email-based attacks, or whether it's through those device-based attacks that I talked about, and lower your attack surfaces. And um, so Microsoft has a whole suite of Defender products, but now called XDR, extended detection and response. And so, but there's ATP, or Advanced Threat Protection, now called Defender for Office 365. There's Defender for endpoints. There's Defender for identity. Defender for cloud apps. All part of the suite of XDR, depending on the licenses and so forth. I will make one little tip here that a lot of folks use maybe a third-party product to do some of their safe links kind of thing, where they do an address rewrite and a Mimecast, a Proofpoint. A lot of those do that. You should only do one of those. Don't turn on safe links in 365 if you're going to use a address rewrite, because you'll get a lot of false positives, and it actually creates quite a bit of a headache. Just a little bit of a FYI there. We should secure a collaboration with Microsoft Teams in a way that, Microsoft Teams, I have an article on this that I can share, but Microsoft Teams, the guidance from Microsoft on Teams is to configure teams at three different, consider three teams in three different levels. So there's a baseline, there's sensitive, and there's highly sensitive. So introducing Copilot is a good time to review your environments to ensure that the appropriate protection is configured. But we should consider, what is our sharing policy? What is our default sharing policy? And so we need to really kind of kind of think through that a little bit. Yeah, I know I just talked to an organization yesterday that said we you know, we're not doing any external sharing because part of our governance view, when I look at a client, I look at some of their sharing policies, um, and we talk to them about sharing. And it's not a um, external sharing is not necessarily a bad thing. Having sensitive items in the organization isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's what are we doing about that, and how are we doing it? Consider this: if you share, if you say we're not doing external sharing. And that's totally acceptable, and that's totally fine. And CIS, the Center for Internet Security, would probably agree with you on that. But my philosophy is to, when it comes to security and compliance, to make it easy for the user to do the right thing. Well, if you block sharing, users are, chances are they're going to share anyway, because what's preventing them, and that was to my question, my opening question, what do you have in place today that prevents a user from accidentally, forget about intentional, although that could be part of it, but accidentally sending and sharing sensitive information outside the organization? Um, so if we block external sharing, then if they right click or go down to the OneDrive or the SharePoint share or Team share, and they don't have that option, right? But what's preventing them from dropping it into a raw attachment on an email and sending it out the door that way? Users are sharing data they can. So what's preventing that? So my philosophy is not necessarily to block external sharing. And if that's your company's security posture, I'm completely in support of that. But at the very least, we should make it possible for users to do this in a secure way. Now, DLP policies, regardless of how something is attached, can prevent it from going out the door. So anything that's highly sensitive or sensitive, or whatever rules we have in DLP or data loss prevention, can still block it and do whatever policy, regardless of how we attach it. But just food for thought there. So we wanna consider how we're sharing data there. And of course, we want to we want to have you know general rule of thumb is giving the user just enough access to do what they need to do and not any more. We'll move along from this one here. The only thing I would add is some best practices around elevated permissions. Just a few things, and these are right from the CIS controls, by the way. You a global admin account should never be a synced account. It shouldn't be synced from on-premise. It should be born in the cloud. It should be in the cloud. User accounts should be have separate accounts for global admin or any other elevated role rather than their day-to-day user account. Those global admin accounts should also not contain a license. Generally, it should not be licensed accounts. And we should be using privileged identity management or Entra ID management, privilege management, whatever their name Microsoft gives it today, but to where we give just-in-time access and just enough access. Learn roles, learn what's the minimum level of role I need. For example, most software companies that integrate into 365 say, I need global admin. Well, you probably don't because you're not making any changes. What you probably need is global reader, right? So that's a good role that Microsoft came out some years ago that really helped in that regard. So think least privilege when it comes to that. Stepping into web grounding real quick, this just briefly, we'll talk about this, but when it comes to like, and by web grounding, we're talking about things that aren't necessarily connected to your data, although they could be because of the graph we showed earlier. But specifically, what do what are some security controls we should do for users that are accessing Copilot Microsoft Copilot, right? Being chat or enterprise chat, and we should do conditional access policies that at a minimum require multi-factor and trusted and healthy devices, and that's part of that enrollment. We can enroll those Windows devices as well as with that Intune. Um, we were talking mostly about mobility, but it certainly stretches over to the Windows desktop as well. Just a quick overview of what this looks like here. We're probably very familiar with this. We have Copilot, now we have Copilot for 365, which we're largely talking about today, and some of the cost differences here. One being free, included with your enterprise subscription. The other one, part of this Big Daddy Copilot, $30 a year, just paid annually. And a lot of people balk at that $30 a year, but I'm telling you, it saves an awful lot of time. Both solutions really do, but there's just some differences there. The free version is primarily takeaway is web grounded only, whereas the Copilot for 365 is web grounded by default, can be turned off, but it is definitely graph grounded. It taps into your data. Um, and so when it comes to Microsoft 365 Copilot or Copilot for Microsoft 365, both are able to be used here. And again, that's configurable. That could be um, turned off there. As we move into some of the compliance, specifically compliance and tenant stuff you should do on your tenant. I mentioned this graphic here to the right here, and this kind of illustrates a little bit of that. It's all part of insider risk, which is part of purview. But we're talking about different levels of risk, sign-in risk. If the user's in elevated risk, then you have a DLP policy that can be dynamically applied depending on that level of risk. So that's just a little bit about that. So, but some of the features and specific things that we should look at inside Copilot for 365 and Purview is auditing. We should turn on auditing, and that's just you go to compliance.microsoft.com, go to audit. By the way, if you go to purview.microsoft.com and you click on anything in Purview, it's going to take you to compliance.microsoft.com. Playing the word game with Microsoft, but that's auditing. You'll have a blue bar across it that says start recording activities in so many words. So it needs to be turned on. Go out there and turn that on. That way, admin activities, who's made a change to configurations, and then also user activities. And there are some roles and responsibilities around that as well. Communication compliance is kind of an interesting one. They used to be part of supervision, and then it was originally intended to prevent cyberbullying in education schools, to capture phrases that would indicate there was some bullying going on. Microsoft then took it was successful. Microsoft took that and changed it to communication compliance. They were going to call it communication DLP at one point. They don't think that it's still communication compliance, but what that does is it takes phrases in Teams and chats and email, just kind of different work streams, and associates it with a category. For example, a threat, bullying, intimidation, and I've used it in really heavily regulated industries of communication compliance. Good. Of course, e-discovery allows us to build cases and do content searches, um, searching for all of information that we may need throughout the environment, including Copilot chats. Information protection, we kind of talked a little bit about that, but that's really, we're talking labeling and classification there. Data loss prevention, and then that adaptive protection, which is kind of what's illustrated a little bit out there to the side. Takeaways just from this slide here, we'll just talk about, in a nutshell, apply sensitivity levels, continue to, you know, monitor and configuring those access permissions and monitoring those and those changes. Um, you know, Data structuring is important. We'll touch on that as well, but implement data loss prevention, very important. At the very least, start there. That prevents some accidental sharing and of information within your organization. I'm going to make a few call outs here. We'll discuss some of these in a bit, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. when Microsoft moved to the new licensing requirements around Microsoft Copilot or Copilot 365, they it was enterprise. It was pretty much enterprise. You had to have an enterprise. You had to have more than 300. You couldn't just buy a single license. Well, now it extends all the way from business standard all the way up to E5. Don't do business standard. Just don't, because it only comes with Entra IP free, and whereas Entra IP one at a minimum is business premium. Upgrade those licenses to business premium, where you've got some of these purview capabilities. You don't have those in business standards, so really all your, it's just not a good idea to do business standard. I'm here to protect you from Microsoft. So current channel for enterprise apps, you need to be using the new Outlook, which I have shifted to, and I really like it. I've kind of went back and forth, but now I really do like it. It's kind of checking all the boxes for me. But you need to engage in Copilot there. Um, all versions of Teams you can use, but you really should move to the new Teams. Um, and uh, and then if you want Copilot to interact with Loop, which I mentioned Loop a little while ago, and it does a lot of good things there, you need to enable it in your organization. And your data also needs to be properly aligned. And so by that, I mean, if you've got multiple files that have basically the same content, Copilot's going to get a little bit confused about what it's actually looking for. So data structure and data permissions, really, really key. As we get through some of these best practices here, getting right down to it, data identification. So we need to identify and understand and classify data. Proper data classification is a foundation for governance. What's sensitive, what's not, what can be shared publicly. Take some time and classify that data, and then move on and apply labels to those classifications. We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. Um, and we should have some geographical restrictions. So be aware and adhere to any of the necessary regulatory geographical restrictions of your data. If you're already using Microsoft Copilot or Microsoft 365, it's probably not going to change really a whole lot. Still, we should maintain, any boundaries, such as the EU data boundary, is central to ensuring we have regulatory compliance. And talking about that, there's a new regulation called the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, and a lot of these are moving pretty quickly. So even though Microsoft says that they will continue to, mature their products to adhere to any new regulations, you should just always be aware of any regulatory requirements in your area. Essentially, that particular act just says mostly everything that we've talked about, but it says you have to do it, right? Businesses have to have the unacceptable risk is prohibited, right? I mean, common sense stuff, but it's not just optional, right? That's part of that EU Act. And so be aware of some of that stuff. Um, do an AI risk assessment. Strongly recommend an AI risk assessment. Um, and something that we offer. I'll hit that in just a minute, but familiarize familiarize yourself with potential risks that could arise from using data with Copilot, and then get out there and you know um, whether you do it yourself through some toolings and some things that we have. There's some good stuff out there, but it's something that we certainly do. But I highly recommend doing some sort of, what's the impact going to be? Um, Other best practices: form an IT governance committee. This, it's basically forming a formal framework to work off of to have an organization or a department within your organization. Nothing necessarily official, but members where they discuss governance things. And these folks should be representative across the board. They shouldn't just be IT folks. Um, they should be members from IT, members from HR, members um, from marketing. So a diverse group of people should be included in this IT governance committee. Something that we help organizations form as well, and I think that's really important. So even consider external experts and consultants that can help with that as well. Be part of that committee. So you should draft charter outlines about what the mission statement, the goals, the authority, the area of responsibilities and focus and so forth. Um, Part of that IT governance committee. Setting those frequency of meetings, just has to lay in the framework for what that committee is going to be working on, and who they, how they report, and rolling up to executive leadership within the organization. But governance committee is a very important thing to have, and that committee continues to monitor any compliance and risk as things change, and it certainly all relates back to how we're going to deploy out Copilot. I'll come through this, and we're getting a little bit short on time, but how does Microsoft use your proprietary information as far as organizational data? So all the prompts and responses from Copilot, um, um, all of that stuff, is only going to surface information that user, that particular user, has access to, primarily at a view level access. So as I mentioned before, Copilot's not going to introduce new risks. It could potentially surface risks, um, and we often demo situations where a user may not be aware that they have access to a particular file, like salaries, Excel spreadsheet, right? Um, and they just do a simple search inside of Copilot, and it surfaces that file. They would have no idea they had access to it other than Copilot surfaced that for them. But Copilot's not going to surface that unless they have access to that. Um, Data is stored within the environment, and this data is accessible through Purview, through content search, through discovery. So admins with the right access, it is discoverable through those means. Users can delete their chat history. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't be captured in e-discovery and through those content searches, but they can actually go in and delete some history of those interactions. And I've done that, gone in and deleted some, but a lot of them I like to keep anyway because um, it may be something that I forgot and I need to go back and search it again, or it kind of reminds me of something I need further research on. But understand, users can delete that. So that's part of the governance story and part of the compliance story. What do we do about that? Um, Copilot for Microsoft 365 calls to the large language model they are routed to the nearest data, the closest data center within the region, but oftentimes it could be with capacity. So capacity, and I mentioned it a minute ago, if they have higher capacity in another region, it may shift some of those calls out there. However, Microsoft is bound with the EU data boundary, so anything governed by that, um, then it stays within the region, and so that's some of the privacy and permission things are out there. And then we talked about the plugin a minute ago from the web grounded. This can be turned on or off. It's on by default, which means that if I'm going and I'm searching something inside Copilot and it wants to extend, it's not finding relevant information within my data set, it can go out and look at web stuff, much like let's say Google, right? It's going out and it's actually searching, but it compiles it and gives you all the references and it's very clean. It is enabled by default, but it certainly can be disabled if you want to force all Copilot interactions to stay in-house. And so again, Microsoft, the semantic index, which is that indexing that occurs on your data that Copilot is accessing through the graph, honors the user identity-based access controls. The grounding process is only going to access data that the user has. So as we prepare the organization, kind of button this down just a little bit, the we deploy services, we deploy OneDrive and Exchange. Most of the time that's first step in, right? We deploy Exchange, we deploy Microsoft Teams, so we deploy these services. Then we start adding data layers and wrapping some protections around that, right? Um, then we start looking at data structuring and moving data from on-prem to the cloud, to SharePoint, to Teams, to OneDrive, right? Because remember, it has to be accessible by the graph, okay? So data structuring, but not just moving it, not just lifting and shifting it, but actually having a plan to move your data in an organized fashion with the right groups, the right files. Maybe not everything in your organization from 1970 needs to move to SharePoint, right? The graph and Copilot really need to kind of understand a little bit about your data as far as the structure goes. Foundational productivity, what are we talking about there? I'm talking about some of that, you know, launching Microsoft Copilot, getting users used to using the chat function of Copilot, right? Just that, understanding what it returns, what prompts return different things. And then for doing AI readiness, evaluation and assessment that we talked about just a moment ago. So if we start, well, we talked about this a minute ago, but how Copilot for 365 is available in business standard through ME5. It's highly recommended to ditch the business standard and go with at least business premium, and of course on up from there um, because of the level of purview that we have there. We continue to build on becoming a Copilot ready organization uh, by using other additional core services and adoption, driving adoption, which is something that we're pretty heavy on. Microsoft Teams, the apps in OneDrive and Outlook for Windows, or now the new Outlook is a requirement as far as Copilot goes. But we can start layering in additional compliance, data loss prevention, apply this across these services, the SharePoint site restrictions, um, for OneDrive for Business, SharePoint Online. Um, as we build on this compliance story, you know, we can talk, IRM, file classification, file labeling, data retention, and you can apply data retention policies and uh, some file management stuff in Purview to these. You can also do API connectors that connect to third-party apps, Salesforce or other, just lots of them out there right now. So to kind of summarize a few things, is your data visible to the in scope of the Microsoft Graph? That's a requirement. Even when we do data connectors, we're basically making the graph allow it to connect out to those services. Uh, Whether it's some third party, Salesforce is just a good example. There's lots of others. Copilot from 365 doesn't introduce new risk, but rather exposes existing risks um, by preventing overshadowing of information. And so we just got to be really cognizant of that. Classifying, protecting, and governing your data has never been more pivotal than it is today. So we really need to be committed to, sensitive labels, DLP, retention policies, and all of those things that we've covered today. And so finally, then, do you have a plan forward? Do you have a process in place to continue to do this? That governance committee is a good starting point. Forming a governance committee, implementing periodic access reviews, and all of these things are really going to help you make sure that you have a secure foundation to move forward with Copilot for 365. And given all of the content we've talked today, it's a lot. We can certainly help. So we're, my team at Thrive. This is a lot of what we do here is security assessments and different types of assessments to get Copilot readiness program that we have. Not a sales guy, I'm just telling you that's what it is. It's what we do, and we're certainly here to help. As I mentioned at the beginning of the slide, I think I said at the end I would put my contact information right back up there so that you can reach out to me, connect to me, ask me questions. I know we're just a couple minutes of time, but always always willing to um, to answer questions that I can either about this or other things that we do here at Thrive. So anyway, with that, I'll hand it back over to Sean, I guess, but I appreciate your time today.
Perfect. Thank you, Alan, for a great presentation. So now we'll get into the questions and answers part. Should you wish to ask a question, please feel free to type it in the questions box now. So just our first question today is, are Copilot activities discoverable in Purview eDiscovery?
They absolutely are. They are. Yep, they absolutely are. They're retainable as well. We did. That question may have been asked before we actually got to that, but we did talk about that briefly. But sure, yep, they're in content search as well as a full case e-discovery, and both e-discovery core or standard and advanced today. Yeah.
Perfect, Alan. So just the next question here is, can we reference an Excel file in Copilot in PowerPoint to create presentation?
Great question. Yes, you can. As a matter of fact, and I'll be honest, we've been having a lot of problems, and I'm sure you've noticed Microsoft's CDX environment has been down. So I normally like to demo a lot of things, but their CDX environment's been down and problematic. But you absolutely can. In fact, I sort of referenced it when I said that if I were to create an agenda item by doing a forward slash, which brings up the file context and recent files, and then you can browse from there. But yes, you can. You can, and I do that. I can create a meeting agenda from a file, call in a file, and I can also create a PowerPoint presentation based off of a file in the same way. All of those are in the context of the application. So you would do that from PowerPoint, for example, or from you can do it from Teams if you want to create a meeting, or you can do that right in chat from meetings. But you absolutely can do that. Call in other files. It's a great, and you can call in multiple files as well.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Alan. So just the next question there is, can we assign Copilot for Office 365 license to shared mailbox?
You cannot. You cannot. They have to be, and the reason is because shared mailboxes are generally not licensed anyway. That best practice is you don't share mail. I kind of go back to my exchange days, but shared mailboxes should not be should not have licensing anyway. So
Perfect. It looks like that's all the questions for today. So on behalf of the ESBC community, we'd like to extend a big thank you to you again, Alan, for taking the time today to carry out this webinar. We really appreciate it.
yeah, you bet.
So that's the end of today's webinar. You can find this webinar and more at sharepointeurope.com/resource center. Thanks again for y'all for joining us today, and I hope you join us again soon. Take care.